My husband, Richard, announced he was leaving me for a younger woman, believing he could just walk away from our 25-year history. He didn't realize he was leaving a professional archivist, and I used my meticulous skills to pull one thread that unraveled his entire new life. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The scent of lemon and beeswax hung in the air, a familiar comfort as I polished the old oak dining table. It was a Saturday ritual, a small act of care for the home I had so carefully built. Outside, a persistent autumn rain tapped against the window panes, blurring the world into a watercolor of gray and gold. I was just recovering from a nasty bout of pneumonia that had kept me bedridden for 2 weeks, and this simple domestic task felt like a return to normalcy, a reclaiming of my strength. My energy was still low, a delicate flame that could be extinguished by the slightest breeze, but my spirit felt resilient. The front door clicked open and shut, and Richard walked in, shaking droplets from his expensive trench coat. He didn't call out a greeting as he usually did. The silence that followed was heavy and unusual, thick with unspoken words. He placed his briefcase by the door with a soft thud that echoed in the quiet house. I turned, a smile ready on my lips, but it faltered when I saw his expression. His face, usually so open and easy to read, was a mask of strained neutrality. "Richard, is everything all right?" I asked, my hand still holding the polishing cloth. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, his gaze drifted around the room, landing on the framed photos on the mantelpiece, a collection of our shared life. Our wedding day, vacations in Italy, our niece's graduation. It was as if he was looking at relics from a distant past, artifacts that no longer belonged to him. "Nora, we need to talk," he said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual warmth. He walked over to the armchair by the fireplace but didn't sit. He stood beside it, using it as a shield. A cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. I had spent the last 2 weeks feeling physically vulnerable, but this was different. This was a deeper, more primal fear. I placed the cloth on the table and folded my hands, waiting. "I'm not happy," he began, a cliché so worn and threadbare it was almost laughable. "I haven't been for a long time." I stared at him, my mind racing to comprehend. A long time, we had just celebrated our 25th anniversary a few months ago. He had given me a beautiful first edition of a classic novel, something my archivist's heart had treasured. He had written in the cover, "To my Nora, the keeper of our history and my heart." When had a long time started? A week ago? A month? A year? "What are you saying, Richard?" I whispered, though I already knew. The answer was in the way he stood, the way he avoided my gaze, the way the air between us crackled with the energy of a coming storm. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were those of a stranger. The kindness, the shared jokes, the comfortable affection, it was all gone, replaced by a cool, resolute distance. "It's over, Nora, I'm with someone else." The words hit me with a physical force, knocking the breath from my lungs. I gripped the back of a dining chair to steady myself, my knuckles turning white. The rain against the windows seemed to grow louder, a drumming that matched the frantic pounding in my chest. "Who?" The question was barely a whisper. "Her name is Chloe," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with a practiced ease that suggested he had said it many times before. "And I'm in love with her. I've moved some of my things out already. I'll send for the rest next week." He said it all so calmly, as if he were discussing a business transaction, a simple reallocation of assets. His composure was the cruelest part. There was no grief, no remorse, just the cold efficiency of a man who had already completed the emotional paperwork and was now just finalizing the logistics. He was a financial advisor, after all, and he was liquidating his oldest, most stable investment, me. I felt a dizzying wave of nausea. The pneumonia had left me weak, but this news threatened to shatter me completely. I thought of my work at the university archives, of the delicate, centuries-old documents I handled with such care. Our marriage had felt like one of those documents, precious, timeless, something to be preserved. And he was telling me he had simply set a match to it. "You're leaving," I stated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "Just like that." "It's not just like that," he said, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "This has been coming for a while. We've grown apart. You've been so focused on your work, your dusty old books." The insult was so petty, so designed to wound, that it momentarily cleared the fog of shock. My dusty old books had paid for the down payment on this house. My steady, reliable income had been the bedrock that allowed him to take the risks that built his career. He had always called my work my passion, something he admired. Now, it was a weapon to be used against me. He took a step toward the door, his escape imminent. "I'm sorry for the way this is happening, Nora, but it's for the best, for both of us. You'll see." He turned and walked out, the door closing with another soft, final click. The silence he left behind was immense, a gaping void in the life I had known. I stood there for a long time, listening to the rain, the only sound in a world that had just been rendered unrecognizable. He thought he was just closing a chapter, neatly filing it away. He thought he was just leaving a marriage, but he was really leaving behind a history he couldn't erase. The first few days were a blur of hollowed-out moments. The house, once a sanctuary of shared memories, felt cavernous and hostile. Every object whispered of Richard's absence. The empty space in the closet where his suits used to hang, the indentation on his side of the bed that my body now refused to cross, the single coffee mug I now washed each morning instead of two. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, a curator of a museum to which no one would ever come. My physical weakness from the pneumonia compounded the emotional devastation, leaving me drained and fragile. I slept poorly, haunted by dreams of falling, and ate little, the taste of food turning to ash in my mouth. My sister, Clara, came over every day, her presence a lifeline in the suffocating silence. She brought soup, handled the phone calls from concerned friends, and mostly just sat with me, offering a quiet solidarity that was more comforting than any words could be. "He's a fool, Nora," she said one afternoon, her voice laced with a fury that I was too numb to feel myself. "A 51-year-old cliché with a sports car he probably can't afford and a girl half his age." I just shrugged, stirring the vegetable soup she'd placed in front of me. I hadn't cried yet. The shock was a thick wall of ice around my heart, and I couldn't seem to break through it. It felt less like grief and more like a profound dislocation, as if I had woken up in a life that was not my own. The phone call came a week after he left. I saw his name flash on the screen, and my hand trembled as I answered. "Nora," he said, his voice brisk and businesslike. There was no warmth, no hint of the man I had shared my life with. "I need you to sign some papers." "What papers?" I asked, my voice raspy. "Just some preliminary separation documents. My lawyer is drawing them up. It's mostly financial declarations. I'll have them couriered over tomorrow." He paused, and I could hear the faint sound of music in the background, a pop song with a heavy bass line. It sounded young. "It's all very straightforward. I want this to be amicable." Amicable? The word was a slap in the face. He had detonated our lives, and he wanted the cleanup to be polite. "Richard, we've been married for 25 years, I said, a tremor in my voice. "This isn't a business merger. It's a life, our life." "Don't be sentimental, Nora. It's not productive," he chided gently, as if speaking to a difficult client. "Look, I need to get this sorted quickly. Chloe and I are planning a trip, and I'd like to have the initial paperwork filed before we go." His casual mention of her, of their plans, was a deliberate act of cruelty. He was erasing me, and he wanted me to watch him do it. A tiny spark of anger finally managed to pierce the ice around my heart. "I'm not signing anything until I've spoken to a lawyer," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. He sighed, a long, impatient sound. "Nora, don't make this difficult. There's no need to drag this out and make things ugly. It is what it is. I've made my decision." As he spoke, my gaze fell upon the study, the room where I did most of my work from home. My desk was neatly organized, my files meticulously labeled. On the corner of the desk was a stack of archive boxes filled with our shared financial history. For 25 years, I had been the one to manage our household accounts, file our taxes, and keep every important document. Richard had always found it tedious, happily handing over shoeboxes of receipts and unopened envelopes for me to sort. He called me his personal archivist. He'd meant it as a term of endearment. Now, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like power. "I won't make it difficult, Richard," I said, my tone shifting subtly. "I just want to be thorough. You, of all people, should appreciate the importance of due diligence." There was a brief silence on his end. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "Do what you have to do, just don't drag your F." "Eat." He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood there, the dial tone buzzing in my ear, and a thought began to form in my mind, clear and sharp. Richard saw our marriage as a collection of assets to be divided. He saw our history as something to be discarded, but he had forgotten one crucial thing. He had forgotten that our history was documented, and I was the one who held the archives. He had forgotten that I don't just preserve history, I know how to read it. And in those records, in the neat columns of figures and the fine print of contracts, the truth of a life is always written. He thought he was in control of the narrative, but he was wrong. The story was all there, waiting for me to tell it. In the weeks that followed, the shock slowly receded, replaced by a deep, aching grief that was followed by a slow-burning anger. I thought back on our life together, not with the soft-focus lens of nostalgia, but with the sharp, analytical eye of an archivist examining a primary source. I had devoted my life to Richard. When his career in financial advising was just starting, I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, grading papers late into the night after my day at the library. I was the one who encouraged him to start his own firm, who stayed up with him creating business plans and designing logos. I put my own academic ambitions on hold, my dream of getting a PhD in history, because he'd said, "We need one steady income, Nora. Just for a few years, until I'm established." Those few years had stretched into a decade, then 2. I found my calling at the university archives, a job I loved, but it was a quiet, stable career, not the high-flying, lucrative world he inhabited. The sacrifices felt invisible to him now. He saw our beautiful home, our comfortable life, as a direct result of his brilliance, his hard work. He had conveniently forgotten the foundation upon which it was all built, me. I had only met Chloe once, a few months before he left. He had brought her to a company dinner. At the time, she was just Chloe from marketing, his new protégée. I remembered her clearly. She was in her late 20s, with bright, hungry eyes and a smile that was too wide, too eager. She was dressed in a sleek, expensive dress that seemed more appropriate for a nightclub than a corporate event. She had shaken my hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "It is so amazing to finally meet you, Nora," she'd gushed. "Richard talks about you all the time. He says you're the brilliant, organized one who keeps his whole life in order." Her words had seemed like a compliment then, but now they felt laced with a mocking irony. She had assessed me, I realized. She had sized me up as the domestic, stable, and perhaps boring wife. A fixture, not a partner. Throughout the dinner, she had directed all her attention to Richard, laughing loudly at his jokes, touching his arm as she made a point. Her interest in me had been superficial and brief. She'd asked me about my work, and when I'd said I was an archivist, her eyes had glazed over. "Oh, so you work with old stuff," she'd said with a dismissive little smile, before turning back to Richard to discuss a new marketing campaign. Her one pointed question of the evening came back to me with chilling clarity. "This house is just gorgeous," she'd said, looking around the restaurant. "Richard mentioned you two have lived here forever. Is it all paid off?" The question was jarringly inappropriate, a blatant inquiry into our finances from a near stranger. At the time, I'd been taken aback but had answered politely. Richard had just laughed it off. "Chloe's a go-getter, always thinking about the bottom line," he'd said, with an admiring glance in her direction. Now I understood. She wasn't just a go-getter, she was a prospector. She wasn't just interested in Richard, she was interested in his assets. She had seen him not as a man, but as a portfolio. and she had identified me as the primary obstacle to a hostile takeover. The preliminary separation documents arrived by courier, as promised. They were thick with financial jargon, a cold accounting of our shared life. Richard was being generous, his lawyer's cover letter stated. He was offering me the house, which was still heavily mortgaged, a fact Chloe had conveniently not known, and a modest alimony payment for a limited time. In exchange, he would retain the entirety of his business, his investment portfolios, and his pension. The offer was designed to look fair on the surface, to a casual observer. It was meant to be signed quickly, to allow him and Chloe to ride off into the sunset on a golden parachute funded by our joint efforts. I spread the documents across the dining room table, the same table I had been polishing when my world fell apart. My anger began to solidify into something colder and harder: resolve. Richard and Chloe saw me as a relic, a piece of the past to be archived away. They saw me as sentimental, unproductive someone who dealt in dusty old books. They thought I was the soft, gentle keeper of memories. They had no idea that an archivist's job isn't just to preserve the past. It's to organize it, to index it, and to expose the truths hidden within it. They had started this, but I was going to finish it. And I would use the very skills they so casually dismissed to do it. The turning point didn't come with a dramatic, tear-filled breakdown. It came in the quiet, dusty silence of our home office. For 2 weeks, I had allowed grief to be my primary companion. I had floated through my days in a fog. But as I sat there, staring at Richard's offensively one-sided proposal, the fog began to burn away. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but it was now joined by a cold, clear-eyed fury. I was not a victim to be managed. I was a partner, a builder of this life, and I would not be quietly erased. My profession had trained me for this moment. An archivist's mind is wired for patterns, for details, for the patient sorting of chaos into order. We follow the paper trail. We connect disparate pieces of information to form a coherent narrative. Richard and Chloe saw me as a gentle librarian. They had forgotten that my job was to be a detective of history. The clever trap wasn't a single brilliant idea, but the very foundation of my life's work. It was my meticulous, 25-year curation of our financial lives. Richard thought the past was gone, but I knew it was all right here, filed away in labeled boxes in the basement and on password-protected hard drives in my study. I began not with a lawyer, but with my archives. I pulled out the boxes, one for each year of our marriage. Inside were bank statements, credit card bills, tax returns, mortgage documents, loan applications, receipts for major purchases, everything. Richard had always joked about my hoarding, but it wasn't hoarding. It was preservation. With a thermos of strong coffee by my side, I started my work. I decided to focus on the last 3 years, the period when, in retrospect, Richard's behavior had started to change. He'd become more distant, more obsessed with his appearance, and more secretive about his work. I laid out the bank statements month by month, using colored highlighters to categorize the spending. Green for household bills, blue for his personal expenses, yellow for mine, and pink for anything that seemed unusual or unexplained. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The sea of green and blue was suddenly interrupted by a growing number of pink highlights. There were cash withdrawals from ATMs near a downtown apartment building I didn't recognize. There were payments to high-end restaurants where he'd told me he was having client dinners. There were charges from boutique clothing stores and a luxury spa, places he would never go for himself. Then I found the first significant thread. It was a recurring monthly payment listed simply as a transfer to a numbered account. It started small, just a few $100s 18 months ago. But over time, the amount had steadily increased. The most recent transfer, just before he left, was for $5,000. It was a significant sum, one that should have been discussed. I cross-referenced the date of the first transfer with my old calendar. My heart sank. It was the week after that company dinner where I had met Chloe. The narrative was clicking into place, stark and ugly. My next step was to look at his business. Richard's firm was a partnership, but he was the majority owner. As his wife, I had access to our joint tax filings, which included the business returns. I spent a weekend poring over the dense documents, my eyes scanning for anomalies. He had started a new corporate entity 2 years ago, a consulting firm under a generic name. He told me it was a shell company for tax purposes, a way to manage expenses. I had trusted him. Now I looked at it with deep suspicion. Using the online business registry, I pulled the company's official documents. The director was listed as Richard, but there was another name on a secondary filing, an application for a business line of credit, Chloe Dubois. Her name, right there in black and white. She wasn't just his girlfriend, she was his business associate. The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place when I accessed our shared online investment portal. Richard had changed the password, but he had forgotten about the security questions. What was the name of your first pet? Scamp. What is your mother's maiden name? Martin. I was in, and there it was. He had taken out a substantial loan against our joint investment portfolio 6 months ago. A loan I had never known about for a sum that made me gasp. The purpose of the loan, listed on the digital paperwork, was business investment. An investment into the shell company he co-owned with his mistress. He hadn't just been having an affair, he had been systematically draining marital assets to fund a new life and a new business with her. This wasn't just infidelity, it was calculated, deliberate financial fraud. I printed everything: the bank statements with the highlighted transfers, the business registry documents, the loan agreement. I organized them into a neat, chronological file, complete with a table of contents and summary notes, just as I would for a historical collection. My hands were steady. The archivist had found her story. Armed with my file, I felt a new sense of purpose. The trembling, heartbroken woman of 3 weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized, a woman made of steel and evidence. I called Richard and told him I was ready to discuss the separation agreement. I suggested we meet at the house, on neutral ground, though I knew it was anything but. It was my territory, the place where the evidence of his betrayal was stored in every file and every memory. He arrived that afternoon, looking relaxed and confident. He was wearing a new, stylishly cut jacket and expensive-looking shoes. The scent of a cologne I didn't recognize filled the hall. He was already living his new life, and this meeting was just a tedious piece of old business to be concluded. "Nora," he said, giving me a tight, insincere smile. "Glad you've decided to be reasonable. I have the papers with me. We can sign them now and get this over with." He placed his leather briefcase on the dining table and clicked it open, revealing the neatly stacked documents that were meant to sign away my future. "I'm not signing those, Richard," I said calmly. I gestured to the chair opposite me. "Sit down, we need to talk about your offer." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, but he sat. He leaned back in his chair, affecting an air of bored patience. "What's there to talk about? It's more than fair. You get the house." "The house with the massive second mortgage you took out against it without my knowledge," I interjected, my voice even. His relaxed posture vanished. He sat bolt upright, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about? There's no second mortgage." I didn't say a word. I simply opened my file folder, which was sitting on the table, and slid the first document across to him. It was a copy of the loan agreement against our investment portfolio, with the date, the amount, and his signature clearly visible. He stared at it, his face paling. He looked up at me, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. "How did you get this?" "You have a habit of underestimating me, Richard," I said, my voice as cool as the paper in front of him. "You see me as the keeper of photo albums and sentimental things. You forgot I'm also the keeper of financial records. Every last one." He was speechless for a moment, his mind clearly scrambling. "It was a business loan, Nora. It had nothing to do with you. It's a corporate debt." "A corporate debt for a business you started with marital assets." I slid another set of papers across the table. The incorporation documents for his shell company with both his name and Chloe's name on them. A business called R&C Futures. Let me guess, Richard and Chloe? How creative. He slammed his hand on the table. "This is an invasion of my privacy. You have no right to go snooping through my things." "Our things, Richard," I corrected him softly. "They were our things, our assets, our investments, our money, and you funneled it into a company you started with your mistress. That's not a private matter, it's called fraud." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. His confident facade was crumbling, replaced by the panicked look of a man who had been caught. He started to bluster, to invent clumsy lies. "Chloe is just a consultant. I needed a partner with marketing expertise. It's all perfectly legitimate. You're twisting things, trying to make this ugly because you're hurt." His attempt to paint me as a scorned, emotional woman was pathetic, and it only strengthened my resolve. "Am I? Then perhaps you can explain these," I said, sliding the final set of documents over, the bank statements, with the monthly transfers to Chloe's account highlighted in bright pink. "Consultants usually submit invoices, Richard. They don't typically receive steadily increasing, undocumented payments for 18 months. This looks less like a business arrangement and more like an allowance." He looked at the papers, at the clear, irrefutable evidence of his long-term deception. The color drained completely from his face. All the bluster, all the arrogance, all the patronizing confidence was gone. He was cornered. For the first time since he had walked out the door, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He had come here expecting a swift, easy victory over his sentimental, heartbroken wife. Instead, he had walked straight into a meticulously documented case for his own prosecution. The archivist had presented her findings, and the historical ray. Cord was not in his favor. My initial confrontation left Richard reeling, but his panic quickly morphed into aggression. The next day, I received a barrage of furious texts and voicemails. He accused me of spying, of being vindictive, of trying to ruin him. He was followed by an equally aggressive letter from his lawyer, filled with legal threats and demands that I cease my illegal investigation. They were trying to intimidate me, to scare me back into the role of the compliant, grieving wife. It was a desperate attempt to regain control. Simultaneously, they tried to lock me out. I found my access to our joint savings account frozen. A letter arrived informing me that Richard was petitioning to have me removed from his business's health insurance plan. These were the desperate acts of a man trying to seal the doors to a tomb he thought was empty, not realizing I was already outside with all the blueprints. But his desperation only fueled my determination. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright, who specialized in forensic accounting in divorce cases. When I laid my file on her polished mahogany desk, she looked at me with a newfound respect. "Mrs. Peterson," she said, after reviewing my documents for nearly an hour. "This is extraordinary. You've done 90% of my work for me. This isn't just a case of infidelity. This is a clear pattern of dissipation of marital assets and potential fraudulent conveyance." Her words gave my findings a legal weight that was both terrifying and validating. With her guidance, we filed subpoenas for the complete financial records of Richard's company and Chloe's personal bank accounts. It was time to see the full extent of the rot. While we waited for the official documents, Richard made one last-ditch effort to appeal to my emotions. He showed up at the house unannounced one evening, his demeanor completely changed. The anger was gone, replaced by a practiced, sorrowful contrition. He spoke of our shared history, of the good years, and apologized for the pain he had caused. He even tried to blame Chloe, painting her as a manipulative opportunist who had taken advantage of his midlife crisis. "She's so ambitious, Nora," he said, his voice thick with false sincerity. "She pushed for the business, for the loans. I was confused. I made a terrible mistake." He was still trying to control the narrative, to cast himself as a flawed man who had lost his way. He still believed, after all these years, that he could manage my perceptions. "The mistake wasn't the affair, Richard," I told him, my voice steady. "The mistake was thinking I was stupid. The mistake was believing your bookkeeper wouldn't eventually balance the books." His face hardened. His performance had failed. He left, and I knew the next confrontation would be the final one. The subpoenaed documents arrived a week later, and they were more damning than I could have imagined. Chloe hadn't just been receiving an allowance. She had been living a life of luxury entirely funded by our stolen money. There were receipts for designer clothes, international vacations, a down payment on a luxury condo in her name, and even payments to a reputation management firm. The most shocking discovery was a series of emails between her and Richard, obtained from the business servers. In them, they openly discussed their plan. They referred to me as the asset manager and spoke of freeing up capital once the divorce was settled. They had a timeline, a budget, and a plan for the company they were building with my money. The final piece of irrefutable proof was a wire transfer from Richard's shell company to a personal investment account in Chloe's name for $100,000, sent just 2 days after he told me it was over. Ms. Albright scheduled a 4-way settlement meeting with Richard and his lawyer. This time, I was not alone. We sat across from them at a long conference table. Richard looked tired and worn. His lawyer looked deeply uncomfortable. I let Ms. Albright do the talking. She didn't raise her voice. She simply laid out the evidence, piece by piece, with the cold, methodical precision of a surgeon. She presented the loan documents, the business filings, and the bank statements. Then, she presented the new evidence: Chloe's condo purchase agreement, the wire transfers, and finally, printouts of the emails. She slid a copy of one particularly damning email across the table. It was from Chloe to Richard. It read, "Just be firm with the asset manager. Once she signs, we can finalize the Cayman accounts and be truly free." Richard's lawyer read the email and visibly flinched. He looked at his client, his expression one of utter disgust. Richard stared at the paper, his face ashen. The spell wasn't just broken, it was ground into dust. The narrative he had so carefully constructed of a simple affair, of a marriage that had just run its course, was exposed as a calculated, long T. Conspiracy to defraud me. There was nowhere left for him to hide. Richard, in his infinite arrogance, had planned a small dinner party before the scandal broke. He'd intended it to be a quiet introduction of Chloe to his inner circle, his business partner, a few key clients, and his brother. After I'd refused his initial settlement, he'd stubbornly decided to go ahead with it. A power play meant to signal that his new life was proceeding, with or without my cooperation. He had even cruelly sent an invitation to my email address with a curt note: "For your information." It was the perfect venue. It wasn't a public courtroom, but something far more intimate and devastating: a jury of his peers. Ms. Albright had advised against it, calling it unnecessarily dramatic, but I knew it was the only way to achieve true justice. This wasn't just about money, it was about the truth. I arrived at the upscale restaurant, not as a guest, but as a petitioner. I had called his brother, Michael, an hour earlier and told him I had urgent, undeniable proof of Richard's financial crimes that would affect the entire family. Michael, a decent man who had always been kind to me, agreed to ensure I was given 5 minutes. I walked into the private dining room. The assembled group looked up in surprise. Richard's face went from shock to pure fury. Chloe, seated at his side like a queen holding court, gave me a look of triumphant pity. She thought I was there to beg. "Nora," Richard said, standing up, his voice low and threatening. "What are you doing here? You are not welcome." "I'm not here to dine, Richard," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the suddenly silent room. "I'm here to present the final findings of a financial audit." I looked at his business partner, a man named George. "George, you might be particularly interested in this." I placed a slim binder on the table. "It's a summary of how Richard has been using a corporate line of credit, backed by your shared business assets, to fund his personal expenses for the last 18 months. George's face tightened. He opened the binder. I then turned to his clients. "And for you," I said, my gaze sweeping over them, "I thought you might be interested in the ethical standards of the man managing your money. This is a record of a fraudulent loan application he made against a joint portfolio, misrepresenting the purpose of the funds." I placed another binder down. Finally, I looked at Michael. And Michael, for you, this is the story of where your family's legacy, entrusted to Richard, has actually been going. My voice never wavered. I didn't cry or shout. I simply presented the facts, the archivist laying out the historical record. I spoke of the shell company, the siphoned funds, the plan to hide assets offshore. I detailed the money spent on Chloe, the condo, the cars, the luxury vacations, all paid for with marital and business funds. Chloe attempted to interrupt, her voice high and shrill. She's lying. She's a bitter, jealous woman making things up. I turned my full attention to her. Am I asked, my voice dropping slightly. I pulled out one final sheet of paper. It was a copy of her email. Then perhaps you can explain this email, in which you refer to me as the asset manager and discuss moving funds to the Cayman Islands. Is that a standard practice for a personal trainer? I placed the email on the table in front of her. She stared at it, her face a mask of horror. The color drained away, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a garish parody. She was exposed, not as a glamorous partner, but as a common co-conspirator. The room was utterly silent. Richard stood frozen, his face a mottled shade of red and white. His entire world, his reputation, his business, his family loyalty, was collapsing around him in real time, brought down not by a team of high-powered lawyers, but by his quiet, methodical wife and her filing system. It was Michael who finally broke the silence. He stood up, his face etched with a deep, profound disappointment. He looked at his brother, not with anger, but with a quiet contempt that was far more damning. He picked up the binder I had given him, tucked it under his arm, and walked over to my side. He placed a hand on my shoulder. I think you've heard enough, Michael said to the room. And Richard, you and I will be having a conversation with our lawyers tomorrow. That was the moment of Richard's final, public humiliation. It wasn't my anger that defeated him, it was the quiet weight of his own brother's judgment. He sank back into his chair, a ruined man, staring at the evidence of his own greed laid bare on the table. The celebration was over. The trap had been sprung, and the historical record was now, officially, complete. The aftermath of that dinner was swift and devastating for Richard. His business partner, George, initiated an immediate buyout of his shares at a fraction of Thay. Our value, citing the blatant misuse of company funds. His clients, spooked by the display of unethical and potentially illegal behavior, began pulling their investments. The reputation he had spent decades building was shattered in a single evening. Michael, true to his word, supported me completely, ensuring that the family's assets were protected from Richard's fraudulent activities. Chloe vanished almost immediately. Once the money dried up and the threat of legal implication became real, her devotion to Richard evaporated. The condo, purchased with illicitly obtained funds, was flagged as a fraudulent transfer and became part of the legal battle. Her dream of a life of effortless luxury turned into a nightmare of lawyers and depositions. She left him, just as she had found him, for purely financial reasons. Our divorce proceedings were remarkably short. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had compiled, Richard had no choice but to agree to a settlement that was overwhelmingly in my favor. I received the house, free and clear, a significant portion of our remaining legitimate assets, and substantial, long-term alimony. Ms. Albright ensured that every dollar he had funneled to Chloe was accounted for and returned to the marital estate. Richard was left financially crippled, a man whose net worth had been built on a foundation of deceit that had finally given way. But my victory wasn't just financial, it was personal. In the months that followed, I found a sense of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. The quiet of the house was no longer a haunting silence, it was a peaceful solitude. I reclaimed the space as my own, filling it with my books, my music, and friends who had stood by me. I enrolled in the PhD program I had deferred all those years ago, my passion for history reignited. My work at the archives took on a new meaning. I was not just a preserver of other people's stories, I was the author of my own. One afternoon, about a year later, I was in the university's rare books room, carefully examining a 17th century manuscript. My life was full of studies of friends, of a quiet, deep-seated contentment. I received a call from my sister, Clara. She had seen Richard. He was working at a large, impersonal financial firm, no longer the charismatic owner but a simple employee in a cubicle. He looked older, she said, worn down and insignificant. I hung up the phone and looked back at the manuscript in my hands. The ink was faded, the parchment fragile, but the story it told had survived for centuries. I felt a kinship with it. My own story had been one of betrayal and heartbreak, but I had preserved the truth. I had organized the facts, exposed the lies, and in doing so, I had not found revenge. I had found something far more valuable. I had found my freedom. The past was finally where it belonged, properly archived, indexed, and closed. The future was an empty page, waiting for me to write it.